He doesn't belong here, and I'm calling security right now whether you like it or not." Those were the venomous words that would destroy one woman's life, expose a corporate conspiracy, and prove that the most dangerous person on a plane isn't always the one you'd expect. The humid air of Miami International Airport hung thick with the scent of jet fuel and overpriced coffee. But for Victoria Ashworth, discomfort was something other people experienced. She stood at gate D14, like a queen surveying her domain, her perfectly manicured fingers adjusting the clasp of her $3,000 cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Victoria was 45 years old, though her plastic surgeon swore she could pass for 35, and she wore that lie like another expensive accessory. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back into a severe chignon that screamed precision and control, while her oversized Chanel sunglasses reflected the world back at itself with the cold efficiency of a surveillance camera. She had the kind of beauty that money could buy and maintain, but her expression carried the hard edges of someone who had never been told no and intended to keep it that way. Beside her, completely absorbed in his encrypted phone conversations, stood her husband, Stephen Ashworth, a man who looked like he had been born wearing a $1,000 suit and had never taken it off. At 48, Stephen possessed the particular combination of privilege and paranoia that came from building a legal career on the edge of ethical boundaries. His fingers moved across his phone with the nervous energy of someone juggling more secrets than he could safely contain, and his eyes kept darting toward the gate area with the hypervigilance of a man who knew he was playing a dangerous game. "Richard, look at this absolute chaos," Victoria hissed, her voice cutting through the ambient airport noise like a serrated blade. "Why haven't they called first-class boarding yet? We're paying premium prices to be treated like cattle in this disgusting terminal." Stephen barely glanced up from his phone, where lines of encrypted text were flowing across the screen in what looked like financial data mixed with technical specifications. "Relax, Vic. The plane isn't leaving without us. These things take time." "It's the principle," she snapped, clutching her Hermes handbag with the intensity of someone defending territory. "I shouldn't have to breathe the same recycled air as the economy passengers for 1 second longer than necessary. Do you see the types of people they're letting fly these days? It's becoming absolutely impossible to maintain proper standards." Victoria's internal monologue was a carefully curated catalog of social hierarchies and unspoken rules that she had spent decades perfecting. In her mind, the world was divided into those who belonged in spaces like first-class cabins and country club dining rooms and those who existed to serve them. She had constructed an entire identity around being the enforcer of these boundaries, the one who made sure everyone understood their proper place in the social order. The gate agent, a weary-looking woman named Brenda, whose name tag suggested 20 years of dealing with entitled passengers, finally picked up the microphone with the resigned expression of someone about to enter a battlefield. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now inviting our first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members to board Flight 382 to London Heathrow." Victoria didn't wait for the announcement to finish. She bulldozed past an elderly couple who had been patiently waiting in line, flashing her boarding pass like a badge of authority, while her heels clicked aggressively against the terminal floor. The sound echoed through the gate area with the staccato rhythm of someone who had never learned to move through the world quietly, someone who needed every footstep to announce her importance to anyone within earshot. As she marched down the jet bridge, her mind was already anticipating the familiar ritual of first-class service, the champagne that would be placed in her hand within minutes of sitting down, the hot towels that would be offered with deferential smiles, and the subtle acknowledgement from the flight crew that she was someone who mattered, someone whose comfort was a priority that justified the premium she paid for the experience. What she absolutely was not prepared for was the man who would challenge everything she believed about who belonged in her carefully constructed world. The Boeing 777's first-class cabin was a sanctuary of engineered luxury 12 lay-flat pods, wrapped in butter-soft leather that promised privacy and comfort for those willing to pay the price. Each seat was a personal fortress of privilege equipped with individual entertainment systems, power outlets, and enough space for even the most demanding passenger to spread out and claim their territory. Victoria's seat was 1A, the throne of first-class real estate. But as she entered the cabin, her confidence faltered like a record skipping on a scratch. There settled comfortably in seat 1B, directly across the aisle from her designated domain, sat a man who completely contradicted every assumption she had made about who belonged in this exclusive space. David Freeman looked to be in his early 50s, with the kind of quiet dignity that came from years of carrying responsibilities that most people couldn't imagine. He wore a faded Yale University hoodie that had seen better decades, dark jeans that showed signs of regular wear, and a pair of worn sneakers that suggested comfort mattered more to him than making impressions. His reading glasses were perched on his nose as he read a thick paperback book with a cracked spine, and his only luggage was a battered leather satchel that had clearly traveled more miles than most people's cars. But there was something in his posture, something in the way he held himself that suggested depths beneath the surface that Victoria's quick judgments couldn't penetrate. He had the bearing of someone who was completely comfortable in his own skin, someone who didn't need external validation to know his worth, and that confidence created an invisible force field around him that made Victoria's assumptions bounce back like rubber balls hitting a brick wall. David's mind was occupied with thoughts that had nothing to do with the luxury surrounding him and everything to do with the daughter who had become the center of his world since his wife's death 3 years earlier. Amara Freeman was 28 years old and about to captain her first international flight for a major commercial airline, an achievement that represented not just personal success, but a breakthrough in an industry where people who looked like her were still fighting for recognition and respect. He was traveling to London to surprise her to be there when she walked through the airport terminal wearing the 4 stripes of a commercial airline captain, and the thought filled him with the kind of pride that money couldn't buy and status couldn't replicate. The book in his hands. Crisis Leadership in Aviation wasn't casual reading, but preparation for a conversation he hoped to have with his daughter about navigating challenges in an industry that didn't always welcome diversity with open arms. Victoria stared at David with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for dangerous wildlife waiting for someone to come and correct what she perceived as an obvious mistake. She expected a flight attendant to appear and gently escort this clearly confused passenger back to whatever economy seat he had obviously wandered away from. But as the seconds ticked by and no correction materialized, her confusion transformed into something more dangerous. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that barely concealed underlying venom. When David didn't immediately respond, absorbed as he was in his reading, she raised her voice with the entitlement of someone who expected the world to stop and pay attention whenever she spoke. "Excuse me." David looked up slowly, removing his reading glasses with the patient movement of someone who was accustomed to interruptions, but had learned to handle them with grace. His eyes were calm and intelligent, carrying the weight of experience without the burden of bitterness. And when he spoke, his voice had the deep resonance of someone who was used to being heard and respected. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Victoria pointed a perfectly manicured finger at his headrest as if she were identifying evidence in a criminal trial. "I think you're in the wrong seat. This is first class. This is seat 1B, and I'm quite certain there's been some kind of mistake." David smiled slightly, the kind of polite but weary expression that suggested he had navigated similar conversations more times than he cared to count. He reached into his hoodie pocket with deliberate calm and pulled out his boarding pass, glancing at it as if he needed to refresh his memory, though they both knew he was simply giving her time to recognize her error. 1B, he said simply. "That's me." The confirmation hit Victoria like a slap across her assumptions, and she felt her carefully constructed worldview wobble on its foundations. Her jaw tightened as she looked around the cabin for a flight attendant who could restore the natural order she expected, and she spotted Sarah, a young woman who was adjusting pillows with the nervous energy of someone who had already seen Victoria's name on the passenger manifest and was dreading the inevitable confrontation. Miss Victoria snapped her fingers, creating sharp sounds that cut through the cabin's peaceful atmosphere. "Miss, come here immediately. There's been a mistake, and I need it corrected right now." Sarah approached with the professional smile that flight attendants perfected during training, the kind of expression that could remain pleasant even under extreme duress. "Yes, Mrs. Ashworth. How can I assist you this evening? There's obviously been some kind of error with the seating assignments," Victoria said, lowering her voice to what she thought was a discreet whisper, but was clearly intended to be overheard by everyone in the vicinity. "This gentleman seems confused about where he belongs, and I think it would be best for everyone if we could resolve this quickly and quietly." Sarah's expression immediately softened as she recognized David, and there was a warmth in her voice that Victoria found both surprising and infuriating. "Good evening, Mr. Freeman. It's wonderful to see you again. Can I offer you some sparkling water before we take off?" The familiarity in Sarah's greeting hit Victoria like a physical blow, and she felt her grip on the situation slipping away like sand through her fingers. The casual way the flight attendant addressed David, the warmth in her voice, the complete absence of the deference Victoria expected from service personnel when dealing with obvious mistakes, all combined to create a reality that didn't match her expectations. "Wait just 1 minute," Victoria said, her voice rising despite her attempts to maintain her composure. "You're not even checking his ticket. He's wearing a hoodie, for crying out loud. He looks like he just walked off a construction site. How could he possibly afford a seat like this? Did he use stolen miles? Is this some kind of charity upgrade program I wasn't informed about?" As the boarding process continued, and the cabin filled with passengers, Victoria made it her personal mission to document every detail of what she was convinced was an elaborate security failure. She settled into seat 1A with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle, her designer handbag positioned like a shield between herself and the man she was determined to prove didn't belong in her world. Stephen finally shuffled into the cabin and slumped into seat 2A behind his wife, completely oblivious to the war she had already declared. His attention remained focused on his phone, where encrypted messages were arriving in steady succession, each one increasing the tension in his shoulders and the frequency with which he glanced toward the cockpit door. For the next 20 minutes, as economy passengers filed past the first-class cabin like a parade of people Victoria considered beneath her notice, she conducted what she believed was a masterful campaign of psychological warfare. She aggressively fluffed her pillows with unnecessary force, complained loudly to Stephen about declining security standards, and made pointed observations about the types of people airlines were apparently willing to accommodate. "It's absolutely unbelievable." "Stephen," she said, angling her body so her voice would project across the aisle with maximum impact. "You pay $10,000 for a ticket and they let just anyone wander up here. It feels genuinely unsafe. I mean, look at that bag of his. What could possibly be in something that looks like it's been through a war zone? And did you see how nervous he got when I asked questions?" David continued reading his book with the kind of focused concentration that came from years of practice in maintaining professional composure under difficult circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was reading about crisis management while actively being subjected to the kind of bias-driven crisis he had spent decades working to address. He had built an invisible wall of dignity around himself, one that Victoria was determined to demolish with the sledgehammer of her entitlement and prejudice. As the cabin doors sealed and the familiar chime of the fastened seatbelt sign filled the air, the plane began its pushback from the gate with the mechanical precision of a process that had been repeated millions of times. The hum of the engines grew louder, creating a white noise backdrop that should have been calming but instead seemed to amplify the tension that Victoria was radiating across the narrow aisle. Victoria sipped her pre-departure champagne while maintaining her surveillance of David over the rim of her crystal glass, cataloging every movement he made as potential evidence for whatever narrative she was constructing in her mind. When she saw him pull an older model phone from his pocket, her eyes narrowed with the intensity of someone who believed she had just uncovered crucial evidence of suspicious activity. The phone wasn't the latest iPhone that she expected someone in first class to carry, but rather a slightly bulky device that looked more functional than fashionable. David sent a quick text message, probably to his daughter, letting her know he was safely on board and looking forward to surprising her in London, then powered the device down completely, as airline regulations required. But in Victoria's mind, fueled by prejudice and a desperate need to be proven right about her assumptions, that simple act of sending a text and powering down a phone became something far more sinister. Who was he texting? Why did he have what looked like a burner phone? Her brain, operating on the toxic combination of entitlement and bias, began spinning a narrative that was about to spiral dangerously out of control. Stephen, meanwhile, was conducting his own covert operation from seat 2A. While his wife's dramatic performance captured everyone's attention, he was carefully positioning a small electronic device beneath her seat, taking advantage of her loud complaints and aggressive behavior to cover the subtle clicking sounds of his installation process. The device was sophisticated, designed to intercept data flowing through the plane's wireless networks, and it required the aircraft to reach cruising altitude for optimal transmission capability. As the Boeing 777 taxied toward the runway, Stephen found himself in the uncomfortable position of encouraging his wife's racist outburst, while appearing to discourage it, knowing that her behavior was providing the perfect distraction for his corporate espionage operation. He needed her to continue being loud and attention-grabbing, but not so escalated that the flight crew would intervene before his data mining could begin. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, and what should have been a moment of peaceful transition instead felt electric with the kind of tension that preceded storms. Victoria's champagne glass trembled slightly in her grip, not from turbulence, but from the adrenaline of someone who believed she was on the verge of exposing a conspiracy, while David closed his eyes and rested his head back exhausted from a long day of meetings and completely unaware that his mere presence had triggered a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths no one was prepared to face. As the Boeing 777 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of long-haul flight service. The seatbelt sign chimed off, flight attendants began their choreographed dance of premium service, and the rich aroma of warmed nuts and gourmet meal preparation began to fill the first-class cabin. For most passengers, this was the moment when the stresses of ground travel dissolved into the luxury they had paid handsomely to experience. But Victoria Ashworth remained wide awake and hypervigilant, her attention focused on David Freeman with the intensity of a hawk watching potential prey. She had spent the entire ascent cataloging every shift in his position, every scratch of his nose, every adjustment of his reading glasses, as evidence of what she was convinced was guilty behavior. In her mind, she had transformed from passenger to security operative, and she was certain that her vigilance was all that stood between the aircraft and catastrophe. David, meanwhile, had reclined his seat slightly and opened the ruggedized laptop that he carried for work purposes. The screen glowed with complex data streams that looked like incomprehensible code to untrained eyes, but were actually sophisticated aviation security protocols that he was reviewing as part of his ongoing responsibilities. The laptop was military grade, built to withstand harsh conditions and designed for professionals who worked in sensitive positions requiring absolute data security. To Victoria's paranoid and prejudice-fueled imagination, the sight of David working on what appeared to be advanced computer systems was the smoking gun she had been waiting for. Her mind immediately leaped to every news story she had half remembered about cyber terrorism, every movie plot involving hackers and airplane disasters, and every fear-mongering article about the vulnerability of modern aircraft to digital manipulation. "Stephen," she hissed, leaning back over her seat to poke her husband, who was pretending to sleep while actually monitoring the progress of his data interception device through discreet glances at his own phone. "Stephen, wake up. And look at this right now. What is it now, Victoria? I'm trying to rest. Stephen mumbled, though. Internally, he was calculating whether his wife's building hysteria was approaching the optimal level for maximum distraction without premature intervention from the flight crew. He's doing something suspicious, Victoria whispered with the kind of loud whisper that was clearly intended to be heard by everyone in the vicinity. Look at that computer screen. That's not normal passenger activity. That looks like hacking code to me. I've seen enough movies to know what this looks like. Stephen opened his eyes and glanced at David's laptop screen, recognizing immediately that it was some form of official aviation security software, but rather than calming his wife's fears, he saw an opportunity to amplify them for his own purposes. Maybe you're overreacting, Vic. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. His dismissive tone had exactly the effect he intended, stoking Victoria's conviction that she was the only person on the plane with enough awareness to recognize the danger they were all facing. She turned back around and stared at David with increasing intensity, her mind spinning elaborate scenarios of cyber-terrorism and in-flight disasters that would make her the hero who saved 300 lives through her superior vigilance and unwillingness to be fooled by appearances. "Excuse me, Victoria," suddenly shouted her voice, cutting through the cabin's peaceful atmosphere like an air raid siren. The sudden noise made several passengers jump, caused Stephen to open his eyes and look appropriately startled, and sent Sarah rushing back from the galley where she had been preparing the evening meal service. "Mrs. Ashworth, please lower your voice." Sarah pleaded, her professional training kicking in as she tried to de-escalate whatever situation was developing. "Is there a problem we can help you resolve?" "Yes, there is a massive problem, and I can't believe none of you are taking this seriously," Victoria declared, pointing an accusatory finger at David's laptop screen, like she was presenting evidence in a murder trial. "Look at what he's doing over there. That's not normal computer work. That looks like hacking software to me. I've read about terrorists using laptops to interfere with flight control systems." David sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of someone who had faced similar accusations before and had hoped never to encounter them again. He slowly closed his laptop with deliberate calm, recognizing that escalation would only make the situation worse, and turned to face Victoria with the kind of professional composure that came from years of handling crisis situations. "Ma'am," David said, his voice remaining steady. "Despite the ridiculous nature of the accusation, I was reviewing engine diagnostic data for a GE9X turbine system. It's a PDF file containing publicly available technical specifications. I would appreciate it if you would please mind your own business and allow me to work in peace." The measured professionalism in David's response only seemed to infuriate Victoria further, as if his refusal to be intimidated was proof of his guilt rather than evidence of his innocence. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up with the dramatic flair of someone who believed she was making a heroic stand against overwhelming danger. "Don't you dare tell me what to do!" Victoria screeched, her voice reaching a pitch that made other first-class passengers look up from their entertainment screens and meals. "You don't belong here in the first place, and now you're trying to intimidate me for asking legitimate security questions. I don't feel safe flying with someone who's obviously trying to access the plane's computer systems." She turned to Sarah with the wild-eyed intensity of someone who believed she was fighting for her life. "I want him moved to the back of the plane immediately, or I want to be moved to the cockpit. I don't care which solution you choose, but I am absolutely not sitting next to a cyber-terrorist for the next 8 hours. "Mrs. Ashworth, please sit down immediately," Sarah said, her patience finally beginning to evaporate as she realized this was escalating beyond a simple passenger complaint into something that could endanger the safety of everyone on board. "Mr. Freeman has done nothing wrong. He is simply working on his computer, which is completely normal passenger behavior. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I will have no choice but to issue you a formal warning." Victoria laughed with the kind of high-pitched, incredulous sound that suggested she had completely lost touch with reality. "You're warning me. Do you have any idea who my husband is?" "Stephen, tell her who you are." Tell her that she can't talk to us like this." Stephen sank lower in his seat, covering his face with his hands in what appeared to be embarrassment, but was actually satisfaction that his wife's performance was proceeding exactly according to his plan. "Victoria, please sit down. You're making a scene that's going to end up on social media. I am trying to save our lives," Victoria yelled, her voice carrying to the business class section and beyond. "And if that makes me look crazy to people who don't understand security threats, then so be it." In a move that shocked everyone in the cabin, including Stephen, who hadn't anticipated this level of escalation, Victoria suddenly lunged across the aisle and grabbed David's leather satchel from the floor beside his seat. "Hey, David," shouted his calm demeanor finally cracking as he sat up and reached for his bag. "Give that back immediately. That is private property and you have no right to touch it. If you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind showing everyone what's in here." Victoria screamed, clutching the bag to her chest like a shield while backing against the cabin wall. "I bet there's a weapon in here. I bet there's something that proves exactly what kind of threat you really are." The commotion had now attracted the attention of the entire aircraft, with passengers from business class craning their necks to see what was happening, and phones appearing as people began recording the unfolding drama. The excitement was palpable as travelers realized they were witnessing something that would definitely end up viral on social media within hours of landing. Sarah pressed the intercom button with trembling fingers, her voice carrying across the cabin as she made the call that would change everything. "Captain Rodriguez, we have a Level 2 disturbance in the first-class cabin. Passenger has physically grabbed another passenger's belongings and is making accusations of terrorist activity." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet, and everyone in the cabin held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Captain Rodriguez received Sarah's urgent communication while the Boeing 777 was maintaining its peaceful cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, the autopilot systems handling the routine flight operations while he reviewed weather reports for their approach into London Heathrow. The words Level 2 disturbance and terrorist accusations immediately triggered every emergency protocol he had trained for during his 25 years of commercial aviation experience. In the cabin, David Freeman stood slowly, his full height revealing that he was an imposing figure despite his casual clothing. When he rose from his seat, he towered over Victoria, who was still clutching his satchel like evidence in a criminal trial, her face flushed with the adrenaline of someone who believed she was fighting for survival. "Ma'am, I need you to return my bag immediately." David said, his hands visible and open, demonstrating that he posed no physical threat, despite Victoria's hysterical claims. "I am not going to touch you and I am not going to hurt you, but that bag contains sensitive materials that you have no authorization to handle. He's threatening me," Victoria screamed, her voice carrying throughout the aircraft as passengers in economy began standing up to see what was causing the commotion. "He's going to attack me. Someone call air marshals. Someone call the FBI. This man is dangerous." Multiple passengers pulled out their phones, and the flashing of camera lights created a strobe effect that added to the surreal atmosphere of the confrontation. A businessman in row 3 called out, "I saw everything." She grabbed his bag. He didn't touch her, but Victoria was beyond listening to witness testimony that contradicted her narrative. Stephen watched the chaos unfold with carefully calculated expressions of shock and concern, internally monitoring his data interception device while appearing to be completely focused on his wife's safety. He needed the confrontation to continue long enough for his equipment to complete its data mining operation, but not so long that it triggered security responses that would interfere with his corporate espionage mission. Victoria began fumbling with the buckles of David's leather satchel, her manicured fingernails making clicking sounds against the worn metal as she struggled to open what she was convinced contained evidence of terrorist planning. "I'm going to prove it," she declared to the cabin full of recording passengers. "I'm going to show all of you that you're sheep being led to slaughter by your own political correctness." The satchel's contents spilled across her seat in a cascade that immediately deflated her triumphant expectations. Instead of weapons or explosive devices, out tumbled a few protein bars, a change of socks, a framed photograph of a smiling young woman in a pilot's uniform, and a stack of manila folders stamped with official government seals and marked Confidential, Federal Aviation Administration. A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin as Victoria stared at the mundane personal items and official documents, her conspiracy theories crumbling in the face of evidence that contradicted everything she had convinced herself was true. She picked up the framed photograph with trembling hands, as if it might somehow transform into something threatening if she examined it more closely. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible after minutes of shrieking. "Who is this person? This has to be some kind of cover story." "That is my daughter David," said his voice, carrying a cold fury that made everyone in the cabin understand they were witnessing something that had crossed lines that should never be crossed. "Put it down immediately. You have no right to touch her photograph." Victoria's mind, trapped in the prison of her own prejudices and unable to process information that challenged her assumptions, doubled down on her delusion with the desperate energy of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "It's obviously a cover identity," she stammered. "These are stolen government documents. He's some kind of spy or whistleblower. We have to land this plane immediately." She began pounding on the cockpit door with her fists, creating thunderous impacts that reverberated through the cabin while screaming for the captain to acknowledge what she believed was a clear and present danger to everyone on board. The sound was like gunshots in the confined space, causing some passengers to duck instinctively, while others continued recording what was clearly going to become viral content within hours. The Boeing 777 suddenly banked sharply to the left, the movement unexpected enough to cause passengers to grab their armrests and look around with concern. The fastened seatbelt sign didn't just illuminate it, flashed with the urgency reserved for actual emergencies, and the engines throttled down with a change in pitch that experienced flyers recognized as the beginning of an unscheduled descent. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom with the professional calm that pilots maintained even during genuine crisis situations, but there was an underlying tension that made everyone understand this was not a routine announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please return to your seats immediately and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Due to a security incident in the forward cabin, we are diverting to Washington Dulles International Airport. We will be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for immediate landing. Federal law enforcement has been notified and will meet our aircraft upon arrival." Victoria slumped against the cockpit door, a twisted smile of vindication spreading across her face as she looked at David with the expression of someone who believed justice was finally being served. "See," she said, breathless from her exertion, but triumphant in her conviction. "I told you they would take this seriously. You're going to jail, and everyone on this plane is going to know that I saved their lives." David looked at her with an expression that was unreadable, carefully gathering his scattered belongings, while maintaining the kind of dignity that comes from knowing the truth will eventually prevail over ignorance and prejudice. He picked up the government folder that she had thrown on the floor and dusted it off with the gentle care of someone handling something precious and important. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that made several passengers lean forward to hear his words more clearly. "We are indeed landing, and someone is certainly going to jail tonight. But I think you might be surprised by who that turns out to be." The descent toward Washington Dulles was not the gentle approach that passengers typically experienced, but rather the kind of rapid, fuel-heavy landing that emergency situations demanded, and everyone on board understood that their routine flight to London had just transformed into something that none of them would ever forget. The Boeing 777's emergency descent into Washington Dulles International Airport was unlike anything the passengers had experienced during routine commercial travel. The aircraft, heavy with fuel it hadn't had time to burn during normal flight operations, shuddered as air brakes deployed and the pilot fought to bring the massive plane down safely within the compressed time frame that security protocols demanded. In the first-class cabin, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the terrified whispers of economy passengers who had no understanding of why their London-bound flight was suddenly landing in Virginia after less than 2 hours in the air. Victoria Ashworth sat rigidly in seat 1A, her designer clothes now wrinkled from her physical confrontation, but her posture remained defiant as she clutched her Hermes handbag like a weapon of righteous warfare. Her heart raced not with fear, but with the intoxicating rush of someone who believed she had just prevented a catastrophe of historic proportions. In her mind, she was already composing the interviews she would give to CNN and Fox News, imagining the headlines that would read, "Socialite Prevents Terrorist Attack," and the book deals that would surely follow her heroic intervention. "You're going to thank me later, Stephen," Victoria whispered to her husband, who was staring out the window with a face that had gone pale and slick with perspiration. "When the FBI confirms what I suspected all along, you'll understand that I probably saved hundreds of lives tonight. Victoria. For the love of God, please shut up." Stephen hissed through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with a combination of fear and barely controlled panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Diverting an international flight costs the airline tens of thousands of dollars. If you're wrong about this, we're going to face lawsuits that could destroy us financially." "I'm not wrong," Victoria snapped back with the absolute certainty of someone whose prejudices had never been successfully challenged by reality. "Did you see those classified government documents? He's obviously some kind of spy or terrorist trying to steal aviation secrets. Either way, he's a criminal, and I'm the one who had the courage to expose him when everyone else was too politically correct to act." Across the aisle, David Freeman remained completely still, his laptop secured and his expression unreadable as he watched the emergency vehicles gathering on the tarmac below. His face was a mask of professional calm, but his eyes were alert and focused, observing the flight attendants' emergency procedures and listening to the captain's communications with air traffic control. Stephen, meanwhile, was experiencing the particular terror of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing in real time. His data interception device needed several more hours of transmission time to complete its corporate espionage mission, but the emergency landing would cut the signal and leave him with incomplete intelligence that wouldn't satisfy his Shanghai-based employers. The wheels slammed onto the runway with violent force, burning rubber and creating the distinctive shriek of an aircraft landing under emergency conditions. The plane braked hard, throwing everyone forward against their seatbelts with enough force to leave bruises, while Captain Rodriguez fought to bring the massive aircraft to a controlled stop. Instead of proceeding to a normal terminal gate where passengers could disembark through climate-controlled jet bridges, the Boeing 777 turned sharply onto a remote section of tarmac far from the main concourses. This was protocol for potential security threats, isolating the aircraft from populated areas until law enforcement could assess and control whatever danger might exist on board. "Look at that response," Victoria said, unbuckling her seatbelt the moment the plane stopped moving and ignoring the illuminated seatbelt sign that required her to remain seated. They brought the FBI, Homeland Security, probably the CIA. This is exactly what happens when there's a credible terrorist threat. Outside the window, the tarmac looked like a scene from an action movie with flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness and creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos. There weren't just one or two police vehicles, but an entire armada of law enforcement. Port Authority police cruisers, black SUVs with tinted windows that screamed federal agency involvement, fire trucks positioned for potential disaster response, and mobile command units that suggested this was being treated as a major security incident. The engines spooled down to silence, and Captain Rodriguez's voice returned to the intercom with instructions that made everyone understand the gravity of their situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice. Federal authorities are boarding the aircraft to investigate the security incident that prompted our diversion. Do not stand up, do not access overhead bins, and please keep the aisle completely clear for law enforcement personnel. The forward cabin door, normally used for passenger boarding at terminal gates, was opened by ground crew who had positioned a mobile staircase against the aircraft. The rush of outside air hit the cabin, carrying the smell of jet exhaust and rain, while bringing with it the sound of radio communications and shouted commands from the law enforcement teams preparing to board. Victoria stood up and smoothed her skirt, checking her hair in the reflection of her phone screen because she wanted to look presentable when she gave her statement to federal investigators. In her mind, she was about to become the star witness in a major terrorism investigation, and she was already planning how she would handle the media attention that would surely follow. Heavy boots thundered up the metal stairs and into the first-class cabin as 4 officers in tactical gear stormed aboard their equipment, marked with patches reading Homeland Security and Airport Police. Leading them was a man in a sharp suit whose granite expression and clipped badge identified him as the agent in charge of whatever federal investigation was about to unfold. "Nobody move." The lead officer barked, his hand resting near his holster, while his eyes scanned the cabin for threats. "This is a federal security investigation." Victoria stepped confidently into the aisle, raising her hand like she was hailing a taxi, while her voice carried the commanding tone of someone who expected immediate attention and respect. "Officer over here. Thank God you arrived so quickly. I'm the passenger who reported the threat. I'm the one who prevented the attack." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at David's face with the dramatic flair of someone making an accusation in a courtroom drama. "The suspect is sitting right there in seat 1B. He has stolen government documents, and he was using sophisticated computer equipment to hack into the plane's navigation systems. I confiscated his bag as evidence, and I can confirm that he physically threatened me when I tried to protect the other passengers." The lead federal agent stopped and looked carefully at Victoria, then turned his attention to David Freeman, who was sitting calmly in his seat with the kind of composed dignity that immediately commanded respect. The cabin held its collective breath as everyone waited to see how this confrontation would resolve. But what happened next defied every expectation that Victoria had constructed in her prejudice-fueled imagination. "Ma'am, I need you to step back immediately," the agent said to Victoria, his voice flat and professional in a way that suggested he had already made judgments about the situation that she wasn't going to like. "I don't need to step back," Victoria insisted, taking another step toward the federal officers with the confidence of someone who believed her social status granted her special treatment. "I'm the witness here. I'm the one who identified the threat. You need to arrest him immediately for attempted terrorism and assault." "Ma'am, I said step back." The agent roared, his hand coming up in a stop gesture that made Victoria freeze in place, shocked by the lack of deference she had expected from law enforcement. The agent turned his attention to David Freeman, who slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up to his full height of 6 feet 3 inches. Despite his casual clothing, David carried himself with the kind of natural authority that comes from years in positions of genuine responsibility, and something in his posture made the entire atmosphere in the cabin shift in ways that Victoria's privileged mind couldn't process. What happened next would shatter every assumption she had made about power privilege and who really controlled the world around her. The lead federal agent didn't pull out handcuffs as Victoria expected, didn't bark commands for David to get on the ground, and didn't treat him like the terrorist threat that she was absolutely certain he represented. Instead, Agent Thompson stiffened to attention, brought his heels together with military precision, and nodded with the kind of respect that law enforcement officers reserved for their superiors. Sir Agent Thompson said, his voice carrying a deference that made Victoria's confident smile begin to waver. "We received the emergency signal from the cockpit and responded immediately." "Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Victoria's mouth fell open as her brain struggled to process an interaction that completely contradicted everything she had convinced herself was true about the situation. The federal agents were asking David if he was hurt, not reading him his rights, and there was something in their body language that suggested they were dealing with someone whose authority superseded their own. "I'm fine, Agent Thompson," David replied, and his voice was no longer just the deep baritone of a tired passenger, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. The situation has been contained, but we have a serious breach of federal aviation safety protocols that needs immediate investigation. We're ready to assist in any way necessary, sir, Agent Thompson replied, and Victoria noticed that several other passengers were leaning forward in their seats, phones still recording as they tried to understand why the man she had accused of terrorism was being treated like he was in charge of the investigation. "Wait, what's happening here?" Victoria stammered, looking back and forth between David and the federal agents with growing confusion and the first stirrings of genuine fear. "Why aren't you arresting him? He's the terrorist. He's the one with the suspicious equipment and the stolen government files." The cockpit door opened at that moment, and Captain Rodriguez stepped out with the expression of someone who had just realized he had been dealing with a situation far more complex than his initial briefing had suggested. He was a veteran pilot with 25 years of experience and 4 stripes on his shoulders, indicating his senior status. But he approached David with the kind of deference usually reserved for airline executives or federal oversight officials. Director Freeman Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and barely concealed embarrassment. "My sincere apologies for the emergency diversion. I responded immediately when my crew reported a potential security threat, but I should have requested additional information before implementing emergency protocols." The word "director" hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet, and Victoria felt something cold settling in her stomach as the implications of what she was hearing began to penetrate her consciousness. The man she had accused of terrorism, the man she had physically assaulted and publicly humiliated, wasn't just an innocent passenger, but someone whose title suggested authority far beyond anything she had imagined. "Captain Rodriguez, you made exactly the right decision to divert," David said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from years of handling crisis situations. "Flight crew safety protocols exist for good reason, and your response was both appropriate and commendable. However, the events that led to this emergency landing were unfortunate and completely unnecessary." He turned to look directly at Victoria, and there was something in his expression that made her take an involuntary step backward. The passenger in seat 1A created this entire situation through her own assumptions, prejudices, and ultimately her criminal behavior in physically assaulting a federal officer. Victoria's legs felt weak as the reality of her situation began to crash over her like a tsunami. "Federal officer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who are you? What's your real job?" David reached into his back pocket, not for a weapon, as Victoria's paranoid mind briefly feared, but for a leather wallet that he flipped open with practiced efficiency. Inside wasn't a driver's license or credit cards, but a gold federal badge accompanied by a holographic identification card that reflected the cabin lights as he held it up for everyone to see. "My name is David Freeman," he said, his voice projecting clearly to the passengers in business class who were straining to hear every word of the unfolding drama. "I am the Senior Director of Aviation Security and Federal Compliance for the Federal Aviation Administration, and I also serve as the lead security consultant for the board of directors of this airline." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound in the cabin was the distant radio chatter of law enforcement teams coordinating outside the aircraft. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that every assumption she had made, every accusation she had screamed, every act of aggression she had committed, had been directed at someone whose authority in the aviation industry was absolute. "I was not attempting to hack this aircraft. Mrs. Ashworth." David continued, stepping closer to her with the measured pace of someone delivering a verdict. "I was conducting a routine undercover audit of in-flight security systems and crew response protocols. The phone you saw me use was a secure satellite uplink to FAA databases. The classified documents you stole from my bag and scattered across this cabin contain sensitive reports on airport security vulnerabilities." He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. Vulnerabilities exactly like the breach you just committed by physically assaulting a federal officer, stealing classified documents, and creating a false emergency that endangered the lives of 300 passengers. Victoria looked desperately toward Stephen, her eyes pleading for him to intervene with his legal expertise and social connections. But her husband had sunk so low in his seat that he appeared to be trying to disappear entirely into the upholstery. When she called his name, he finally looked up with the expression of a man who was calculating the cost of his association with her and finding it far too expensive to maintain. "Agent Thompson," David said, turning back to the federal law enforcement officer with the crisp efficiency of someone issuing orders. "This passenger has violated Title 49 of the United States Code Section 46,504, which prohibits interference with flight crew members and attendants. She has also attempted to access classified federal documents without authorization, physically assaulted a federal officer, and incited panic on a commercial aircraft in federal airspace." David checked his watch with the casual gesture of someone who had already decided how the rest of the evening would proceed. "I want her removed from this aircraft immediately and processed according to federal terrorism statutes. Agent Thompson, make sure the handcuffs are secure. She has demonstrated a tendency to grab property that doesn't belong to her." The reality hit Victoria like a physical blow, and she felt her knees buckle as she realized that her privileged life was about to be destroyed by her own actions. "No," she whimpered, her voice breaking as she understood that her social status and husband's legal connections weren't going to protect her from federal law enforcement. "You can't arrest me. I'm a platinum frequent flyer. I was trying to protect the plane." "Stephen, tell them who you are." Stephen finally looked up from his seat, meeting the eyes of the federal agents who were now focused on his wife, and made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Officer," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the chaos surrounding him. "I want to state clearly for the record that I asked my wife multiple times during this flight to stop harassing that gentleman. I attempted to de-escalate her behavior, but she refused to listen to reason." Stephen. Victoria screamed the word torn from her throat like a piece of her soul. "How can you abandon me like this? We're married. You're supposed to defend me, ma'am. Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Agent Thompson ordered, pulling steel handcuffs from his belt, while two other officers moved to flank Victoria. "You are under arrest for violation of federal aviation safety statutes." "No! Get away from me!" Victoria swatted at Agent Thompson's hand, and that final act of resistance sealed her fate as completely as if she had signed her own arrest warrant. Two officers moved in with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement professionals who had dealt with uncooperative suspects thousands of times, grabbing her arms and twisting them behind her back while she struggled futilely against their superior strength and training. The metallic clicking of handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in the cabin, creating a finality that made everyone understand they had just witnessed a complete reversal of power and justice that few of them would ever forget. As Victoria was dragged past David Freeman toward the aircraft door, her designer heels catching on the carpet, and her carefully styled hair disheveled from struggling against the federal agents, she made one final desperate attempt to salvage her dignity and deflect blame for the catastrophe she had created. "You've ruined my life over a seat." She spat at David, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams that made her look like a caricature of entitled rage. "Over a simple misunderstanding about airplane seating, you petty, vindictive man." David looked down at her with an expression that contained no anger, no satisfaction at her downfall, and no desire for revenge. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that comes from years of dealing with difficult people and impossible situations. "You destroyed your own life tonight. I wanted nothing more than to read my book and surprise my daughter in London." He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to ensure that only she could hear his next words. "And, by the way, you're now on the federal no-fly list permanently. You'll need to take a bus back to Miami, assuming you make bail." The officers dragged Victoria down the mobile stairs into the Virginia night, her screams of rage and threats of lawsuits echoing across the tarmac while emergency vehicles flashed their lights in a chaotic display that looked like a scene from an action movie. Inside the cabin, a strange phenomenon began in the economy section. Someone started clapping slowly. Then another passenger joined in, and within moments the entire aircraft erupted in thunderous applause that acknowledged they had just witnessed justice served in its purest form. Stephen Ashworth remained slumped in seat 2, unable to look out the window at his wife being loaded into a federal detention vehicle. His attention focused entirely on his phone, where encrypted messages were arriving with increasing urgency. His corporate espionage operation had been cut short by Victoria's dramatic outburst, leaving him with incomplete data and Shanghai-based employers who would not be satisfied with partial intelligence. Agent Thompson reboarded the aircraft and approached David with the kind of deference that suggested their professional relationship extended far beyond this evening's incident. "Director Freeman will need your statement for the federal prosecutor's office, but that can wait until morning. Is there anything else we should be investigating tonight?" David was about to dismiss the agent when his secure phone buzzed with an incoming call that made him check the caller ID with sharp attention. The number belonged to the Secretary of Transportation, and calls from that office at midnight rarely contained good news. "Excuse me for just a moment, Agent Thompson," David said, answering the call while the remaining passengers watched with fascination. "Madam Secretary, good evening." "David, thank God you're safe." The secretary's voice carried clearly through the phone, and her tone contained the kind of urgent concern that made everyone in the cabin understand they were overhearing something significant. "I just received the FBI's preliminary report on the incident. You handled the situation perfectly, but we have a serious problem." David's expression shifted from calm professionalism to sharp alertness. "What kind of problem, ma'am?" "That woman Victoria Ashworth. Her husband's law firm represents the airline's insurance consortium, and they've been handling cybersecurity contracts for several major carriers." The secretary explained her words, coming quickly, as if she were reading from an urgent briefing. David, she wasn't randomly guessing about computer hacking. "Our cybersecurity team detected a sophisticated malware signal originating from the first-class cabin during the flight." David felt something cold settle in his stomach as he looked back at the empty plane and realized that Victoria's racist outburst might have been covering a much more serious threat than anyone had realized. "Are you saying she was involved in cyber espionage?" "Madam Secretary, I'm saying she wasn't the primary threat," David the Secretary replied gravely. "Someone used her as a distraction while they attempted to extract classified data from the aircraft's systems. We need you to reboard that plane immediately and conduct a complete security sweep." The real criminal might have been sitting right behind her the entire time. David's eyes moved to seat 2A, where Stephen Ashworth was still hunched over his phone, and he realized that while everyone had been focused on Victoria's loud, racist performance, her husband had been conducting his own quiet operation in the background. The pieces of a much larger conspiracy were falling into place, and the night's revelations were far from over. "Agent Thompson." David called out, his voice carrying new urgency. "We need to seal this aircraft as a crime scene immediately, and I need you to prevent Stephen Ashworth from leaving this plane until we can conduct a complete investigation of his activities during the flight." The first-class cabin, which had seemed like the conclusion of a dramatic story, suddenly felt like the opening act of an even more dangerous thriller, and Stephen Ashworth was about to discover that his sophisticated corporate espionage operation had just been exposed by his wife's spectacular public meltdown. What had started as a simple case of racial profiling was about to reveal connections to international industrial espionage that would make Victoria's arrest look like a minor traffic violation in comparison. The Boeing 777 first-class cabin took on an eerie quality when it was nearly empty, with only Stephen Ashworth, David Freeman, and 2 FBI agents remaining, while technicians from the cybersecurity unit began their detailed sweep for electronic surveillance equipment. The discarded champagne glasses, wrinkled blankets, and scattered napkins told the story of a flight interrupted by forces none of the passengers could have anticipated. Stephen sat rigidly in seat 2. His expensive suit wrinkled, and his confidence completely evaporated as he watched federal agents methodically search every surface of the cabin with electronic detection equipment. His phone had been confiscated, his laptop secured as evidence, and his carefully constructed persona as a successful attorney had crumbled to reveal the desperate criminal underneath. Agent Chen, a cybersecurity specialist from the FBI's Digital Crimes Unit, approached David with a small black device that looked innocuous but carried implications that would destroy Stephen's life as completely as Victoria's racism had destroyed hers. Director Freeman. We found this attached to the underside of seat 1, a Chen reported holding up what appeared to be a USB drive with a thin wire antenna. It's a sophisticated packet sniffer designed to intercept data flowing through the aircraft's wireless networks and cockpit telemetry systems. David examined the device while keeping one eye on Stephen, who had gone pale and was gripping his armrests with the desperation of someone watching his future disappear. Was it transmitting successfully? Agent Chen? It was attempting to upload intercepted data to a server in Shanghai, Chen explained, but the emergency diversion interrupted the transmission. The device requires sustained cruising altitude for optimal data transfer, and Mrs. Ashworth's outburst forced a landing before the upload could complete. The irony was so complete that David almost smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. Victoria's racist hysteria, intended to get him removed from the flight, had actually prevented her husband from completing his corporate espionage mission and potentially saved classified aviation security data from falling into foreign hands, Stephen David said, turning to face the man who had orchestrated this elaborate conspiracy. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who hired you to steal federal aviation data. Stephen looked up with the expression of someone who had run out of options and was finally ready to face the consequences of his choices. His hands trembled as he spoke, and his voice had lost all the authority and confidence that had characterized his earlier interactions. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Stephen said, his words barely above a whisper. It was supposed to be simple industrial intelligence gathering. Victoria was never supposed to assault anyone. She was just supposed to create a minor distraction while I activated the data collection system. David sat down in the seat across from Stephen, leaning forward with the patient expression of someone who had conducted countless interrogations and knew how to extract information from reluctant witnesses. You manipulated your wife's racist tendencies to provide cover for corporate espionage. That's not just criminal, Stephen. It's evil. I didn't think she would physically attack you, Stephen protested weakly. I just needed her to be loud and attention-grabbing for about an hour while the device collected telemetry data. I had no idea she would escalate to the point of grabbing your bag and forcing an emergency landing. Agent Chen looked up from his examination of the surveillance device. Mr. Ashworth, this equipment is military grade and costs more than most people's houses. Who provided you with this technology? And what specific data were you contracted to obtain? Stephen's resistance finally collapsed completely, and he began talking with the desperate speed of someone confessing to a priest. Red Dragon Holdings, a private equity firm based in Shanghai. They wanted real-time engine performance data on the new GE9X turbines so they could short the stock before quarterly earnings reports. It was supposed to be simple market manipulation, not terrorism. David shook his head with disgust. You endangered 300 lives and compromised national security for stock market profits. How much were they paying you for this data, Stephen? $2 million? Stephen admitted, his voice cracking with shame. My law firm was facing bankruptcy after some bad investments, and they offered me a way out. I never thought anyone would get hurt. Agent Chen. Are you recording this confession? David asked, and when the FBI agent nodded, David turned back to Stephen with the expression of someone delivering a final verdict. Stephen Ashworth, you're going to federal prison for a very long time. Corporate espionage violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act conspiracy to commit cyber terrorism and endangering a commercial aircraft. That's 20 years minimum. While Stephen was being read his rights and led away in handcuffs that matched the ones his wife had worn an hour earlier, David finally had a moment to step outside the aircraft and make the phone call he had been dreading since the emergency diversion began. Amara, sweetheart. It's Dad, he said when his daughter answered her phone in London. I'm calling from Washington Dulles. There was an incident on my flight and I'm not going to make it to London in time to surprise you tomorrow. Dad, I saw the video, Amara Freeman replied, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Someone posted footage of the whole thing on social media. It's already gone viral. Are you okay? I'm fine, baby girl, David said, looking up at the stars that were visible above the airport despite all the artificial lighting. But I'm sorry I missed your first international flight as captain. I know how much that meant to both of us, Dad, Amara said, and David could hear the smile in her voice. I couldn't be more proud of you. You handled that situation with more dignity and professionalism than I could have managed. Mom would have been proud of how you represented our family tonight. As David walked across the tarmac toward the FBI Mobile Command Center, where he would spend the next several hours giving statements and coordinating the investigation, he realized that despite missing his daughter's milestone and enduring public humiliation from a racist passenger, the evening had ended with justice served and his family's honor intact. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that taught the next generation how to face adversity with grace, dignity, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of personal cost. 6 months after the incident that would become known in aviation security circles as the Dulles diversion, David Freeman stood before a packed congressional hearing room in the Rayburn House office building facing the aviation subcommittee that had requested his testimony on discrimination in commercial air travel. The room buzzed with the energy of legislators, industry representatives, civil rights advocates, and media personnel who recognized they were witnessing a pivotal moment in aviation policy. David wore his formal FAA Director uniform, his chest decorated with commendations earned through 25 years of dedicated service, but his demeanor remained as calm and approachable as it had been during his confrontation with Victoria Ashworth. The viral video of that night had been viewed over 50 million times, spawning countless discussions about racial bias, entitled behavior, and the power of maintaining dignity under attack. Director Freeman began, Congresswoman Martinez, the subcommittee chair. Your experience on Flight 382 has captured national attention and highlighted gaps in our aviation system that go beyond mere security concerns. Can you tell us what changes you believe are necessary to ensure all passengers are treated with equal dignity and respect? David leaned forward to the microphone, his voice carrying the same measured authority that had impressed everyone who witnessed his handling of the crisis. Congresswoman Martinez, what happened that night wasn't just about one woman's prejudices or one man's criminal scheme. It revealed how discrimination and bias can create dangerous blind spots that compromise everyone's safety. He gestured toward a presentation screen that showed statistics about discrimination incidents in aviation. When crew members and passengers focus on policing who belongs in certain spaces based on appearance rather than behavior, they miss real threats like corporate espionage, human trafficking, and actual security risks. Bias doesn't just hurt individuals, it makes everyone less safe. The hearing room was completely silent as David continued his testimony outlining the comprehensive program he had developed in response to the incident. The Clear Skies protocol that we've implemented industry-wide focuses on behavior-based security rather than appearance-based assumptions. It trains aviation personnel to recognize genuine threats while treating every passenger with baseline dignity and respect. Over the following hour, David detailed how major airlines had embraced new training programs that addressed unconscious bias, improved passenger complaint procedures, and established clear protocols for handling discrimination incidents. The changes weren't just cosmetic policy adjustments, but fundamental shifts in how the aviation industry approached passenger relations and security. The economic impact has been significant, David explained to the subcommittee. Airlines implementing the Clear Skies protocol have seen a 30% reduction in passenger complaints, improved customer satisfaction scores, and fewer emergency diversions caused by passenger conflicts. When people feel respected and valued, they're more cooperative with legitimate security measures and more likely to report actual suspicious behavior. During the lunch recess, David was approached by Victoria Ashworth's former attorney, who had been observing the proceedings from the gallery. The lawyer looked uncomfortable as he delivered an update that David had been expecting, but dreading. "Director Freeman, I wanted to inform you personally that Mrs. Ashworth completed her court-mandated bias education program last month," the attorney said quietly. "She asked me to convey that she understands the harm she caused and doesn't expect forgiveness. But she wanted you to know that the experience fundamentally changed her perspective on privilege and prejudice." David nodded thoughtfully. "How is she adjusting to the restrictions?" "The permanent no-fly status has been difficult for someone whose identity was built around international travel," the attorney admitted. "But she's been working with community organizations at Miami International Airport, helping with passenger assistance programs. It's genuine community service, not just court-ordered obligation. She seems to have found purpose in helping others rather than policing them." Meanwhile, Stephen Ashworth was serving his 8-year federal sentence at a minimum security facility in North Carolina, his disbarment and asset forfeiture serving as a warning to other professionals who might consider trading their ethics for financial gain. The Red Dragon Holdings investigation had expanded into a broader probe of corporate espionage in the aviation industry, resulting in strengthened cybersecurity protocols and international cooperation agreements. The afternoon session focused on legislative recommendations, and David presented a comprehensive framework for addressing discrimination across all transportation sectors. "Congress has an opportunity to ensure that what happened to me and what I've seen happen to countless other travelers becomes increasingly rare through education, accountability, and cultural change." As the hearing concluded, David felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal vindication. The incident that could have been just another viral video of airport drama had transformed into a catalyst for meaningful change that would protect future travelers from the kind of bias and prejudice that had nearly destroyed multiple lives that night. 1 year after the Dulles incident, David Freeman finally made it to London Heathrow Airport, but this time he wasn't traveling as a passenger. He stood in the British Airways crew briefing room wearing his FAA Director uniform, watching through the window as Captain Amara Freeman conducted her pre-flight inspection of the Boeing 787 that she would be commanding on its journey to New York. At 29 years old, Amara had achieved what many pilots spend decades working toward: command of an international wide-body aircraft for a major airline. Her 4 captain stripes gleamed in the morning sunlight as she walked around the aircraft with the confident professionalism that David recognized as a combination of excellent training and inherited determination. "She's remarkable," said Captain Williams, the British Airways chief pilot who had invited David to observe his daughter's promotion ceremony. "Captain Freeman has become one of our most requested pilots for challenging routes. Passengers specifically ask to fly with her because word has gotten around that she's exceptionally skilled and completely unflappable under pressure." David smiled with the kind of pride that only a parent can understand. "She gets that composure from her mother. I just taught her never to let other people's limitations define her possibilities." The pre-flight briefing concluded, and Amara approached her father with the confident stride of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than demand it through entitlement. She wore her captain's uniform with the same natural dignity that David brought to his federal director position, and her presence filled the room with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone understand they were witnessing excellence in action. Dad Amara said, embracing him with genuine warmth. I still can't believe you flew all the way to London just to watch me taxi away from the gate. I missed your first international command flight because of that incident. David replied, holding his daughter at arm's length so he could see the captain's stripes she had earned through years of dedication and skill. I wasn't going to miss celebrating your promotion to chief pilot for the North Atlantic routes. Captain Williams cleared his throat respectfully. Captain Freeman, your father has been telling us about the diversity mentorship program he's implementing across the aviation industry. We'd love to have British Airways participate as an international partner. Amara's expression lit up with enthusiasm. Dad, you didn't tell me you were expanding the program globally. That's incredible. The incident that night taught me something important, David explained to his daughter and the assembled British Airways personnel. Individual courage and dignity matter, but real change requires building systems that support and protect people who face similar challenges. The mentorship program connects young aviators with experienced professionals who can guide them through industry obstacles. Over the next hour, as Amara prepared for her flight and David toured the British Airways training facilities, they discussed how the events of that night had rippled outward to create opportunities neither of them could have anticipated. The viral video had brought David national recognition, leading to speaking engagements, policy consultations, and the chance to influence aviation culture on a broad scale. You know what I'm most proud of? David asked his daughter as they walked toward the gate where her passengers were boarding. It's not that I kept my composure when that woman attacked me. It's that you've seen how to handle adversity with dignity, and you're passing those lessons on to the pilots you're mentoring. Amara paused at the jet bridge entrance, her captain's cap positioned perfectly and her flight bag slung over her shoulder with practiced efficiency. Dad, what happened that night wasn't just about racism or corporate crime. It was about proving that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and that the most powerful response to hatred is living your best life with integrity. As David watched his daughter board the aircraft that she would command across the Atlantic, he reflected on how a single night of confronting ignorance and bias had led to meaningful changes that would benefit countless future travelers. The woman who had tried to remove him from his seat had inadvertently helped create programs that would ensure other passengers never faced similar discrimination. The aircraft pulled back from the gate, with Amara's confident voice coming over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and announcing the flight plan she had meticulously prepared. David stood at the terminal window watching the Boeing 787 taxi toward the runway and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that create better futures for the next generation. When the plane disappeared into the London sky, David pulled out his phone and saw a text message from an unknown number. Director Freeman, this is Sarah, the flight attendant from that night. I wanted you to know that I'm now training new crew members using your Clear Skies protocol. Thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like under pressure. The ripple effects of dignity and professional excellence continued to spread, creating positive change in ways that David was still discovering, one conversation and one policy improvement at a time. 5 years have passed since the night that Victoria Ashworth's prejudice and Stephen Ashworth's greed collided with David Freeman's quiet dignity on a flight that was supposed to be routine. The incident has become more than just a viral video or a cautionary tale about the dangers of racism and corporate espionage. It has transformed into a case study taught in business schools, law enforcement training programs, and diversity workshops around the world. David Freeman continues his work as Senior Director of Aviation Security for the Federal Aviation Administration, but his responsibilities have expanded to include chairing the International Aviation Dignity Council, a coalition of airlines and regulatory agencies committed to ensuring that air travel remains accessible and respectful for passengers, regardless of their background or appearance. The Clear Skies protocol has been adopted by every major airline operating in U.S. airspace and has been voluntarily implemented by carriers in 47 countries. Captain Amara Freeman has become one of the youngest chief pilots in commercial aviation history, and her mentorship programs have helped launch the careers of over 200 aviators from underrepresented communities. She speaks regularly at industry conferences about leadership resilience and the importance of maintaining professional excellence while advocating for positive change within traditional industries. The impact of that single night extends far beyond the aviation industry, inspiring conversations about bias, privilege, and the power of responding to hatred with dignity rather than anger. Educational institutions use the incident as a teaching tool for discussing conflict resolution, crisis management, and the importance of addressing prejudice before it escalates into dangerous situations. Victoria Ashworth completed her community service at Miami International Airport and has become an advocate for bias education programs, speaking to community groups about how privilege and prejudice nearly destroyed her life and the lives of innocent people around her. Her transformation from entitled socialite to humble volunteer serves as proof that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices can be overcome through genuine self-reflection and commitment to change. Stephen Ashworth was released from federal prison after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence, and his experience has been documented in a book about corporate espionage and the personal costs of choosing financial gain over ethical behavior. The investigation sparked by his crimes led to enhanced cybersecurity protocols that have prevented dozens of similar data theft attempts in critical infrastructure industries. The Boeing 777 from that night continues to fly international routes, but Seat 1B has been designated with a small plaque reading "Dignity in Service" as a reminder to crew members and passengers that respect and professionalism can overcome any challenge. The aircraft has become something of a symbol within the airline industry, representing the possibility of transformation and positive change emerging from moments of crisis. Perhaps most importantly, the incident has demonstrated that individual actions, whether motivated by prejudice and greed or by dignity and integrity, can create ripple effects that influence entire industries and inspire legislative change. David Freeman's calm response to Victoria's attack and his professional handling of Stephen's conspiracy have become the gold standard for crisis leadership, proving that the most powerful victories often come not from fighting back against hatred, but from refusing to let hatred diminish your commitment to doing what is right. The story serves as a permanent reminder that in a world where prejudice and corruption seem increasingly common, the choice to respond with dignity, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice can create positive change that extends far beyond any single incident or individual experience. Today, David Freeman continues his aviation security work while serving as a national advocate for dignity in travel, and Amara has become an inspiration to young aviators worldwide, proving that excellence and integrity create more powerful change than anger or revenge. Their father-daughter partnership in mentoring the next generation of aviation professionals has become a model for other industries seeking to address bias and discrimination through positive leadership rather than punitive measures. Victoria's genuine transformation through community service demonstrates that even deeply ingrained prejudice can be overcome through humility and genuine commitment to understanding the harm caused by bias, while Stephen's imprisonment and disgrace serve as a stark warning about the personal and professional costs of choosing financial gain over ethical behavior. The incident has become a cornerstone case study in conflict resolution and crisis management, inspiring policies and training programs that have measurably reduced discrimination incidents across the transportation industry, while proving that individual moments of courage and dignity can create lasting positive change for countless future travelers. If you enjoyed this story of justice transformation and the power of responding to hatred with dignity, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people who create extraordinary change. Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can all work together to build a more respectful and just society.